After lots of talk and speculation in the nerd community, the newest MCU film has finally been released, The Eternals, with reviews from the critics ranging from really bad to really good. A lot of fans seem to be split on this upcoming MCU installment. But how did the movie actually turn out? Let's take a look at The Eternals. So starting off, The Eternals is the newest, as we know, the newest film in the MCU being installed. We are now getting up their numbers into the 20s of these films. We are post in-game. We are introducing a lot of new characters to this universe. And the Eternals, a group of heroes that are not super well known in the comic book world, let alone to general audience fans. So this is definitely was going to be something that the Marvel was going to be testing the waters with. Not sure how the fans would react to this. So as you know, this movie had to do a lot of building up to kind of build this world and the lore of the Eternals. And so a lot of the movie focused around setting up the backstory of why the Eternals are here, who created them, their ties to the Celestials, their ties to the Deviants, their why they have not interfered in all of the conflicts that the heroes have gone through in the MCU, and not to mention other things that have happened throughout their time on Earth, then different events in history, and why they haven't intervened. So obviously, going through all this, a little bit of the information can be confusing at times when they're explaining how the Celestials created different universes, why they created the Eternals, the Deviants, and all that different stuff. And so there can be some points where people might get a little confused with a lot of explanations trying to show and talk about what happened and how they got there. So this definitely didn't feel like a superhero movie in the typical sense, which can definitely be something that could turn audiences off. There were moments in the movie where the pace was a little bit slower. There was some talking and stuff, not quite to the extent of some other things. I'm looking at you, Loki, where there was a lot of sitting and talking. It wasn't quite to that extent, but there were some moments where it felt a little slow and I felt a little dragged. With the runtime of 2.5 hours, you can definitely see that there was a little bit, but there was a lot that they had to build up and a lot of characters that they tried to include in this movie. So even though there was some slow points, there was action, and I don't think like it was lacking in action. There wasn't obviously as much as a lot of the MCU movies at this point, but I felt like when they used the action, that it was done well. For the most part, their battles with the Deviants were pretty cool, and the last fights towards the end of the movie were also pretty good. So even though it wasn't full of brimming to the rim with action, it was still felt that the action was handled properly when it was employed. And with the fact that it is part of the MCU, you expect it to be tied to the larger world around it, and for the most part, it stays away from the rest of the MCU. Obviously, it does reference things like Thanos and the Snap, and some outside things like the Avengers are mentioned briefly, which I believe we see in the previews. So this wasn't any secret. But for the most part, it tends to stay away from the rest of the MCU, and in fact, most of the probably more references to the DC universe in this Marvel movie than the Marvel universe at large, with both Batman and Superman getting a obvious reference stating their names practically in the movie. So that was definitely interesting. I don't know that I've ever seen that in an MCU film, but that was just a nice little Easter egg, I guess. With this story taking place is being drawn heavily from the Earth X trilogy by Alex Ross and Jim Krueger, where the celestial seed for the new celestial being born is planted within the Earth, and that causes conflict because it's going to destroy the planet and kill everyone on it when he is born. And so this is the same kind of plot that we find in the Earth X trilogy, and the heroes finding that out, but just kind of done in a little bit smaller scale with just being surrounded by the Eternals, and them kind of finding out about their history, and that's why they were really placed on Earth. And so this is where they're kind of drawing from that. Obviously, in the comic, it was a much grander scale with basically all the heroes being involved, different things. It was a whole trilogy of comics that happened. So this was definitely a lot smaller scale, but this was where they drew the inspiration and pulled that from. Now, one thing that needs to be addressed, because a lot of people have been talking about, is the diversity and representation that there's been a big talk about, whether you're for or against, whatever the case may be. People say, they're on side, they're on that. This has been a topic that a lot of people have talked about, especially with the just accusations, people review bombing even before the movie came out, just because of representation being included in the movie. Now, obviously, we know that it was completely obvious that they did put these representation of these diverse characters in the movie. It was no secret. They specifically stated they took a little known team so they could do this very thing, and they could make the cast a wide variety of races and genders. Now, the only thing I will say that is, so we knew this coming in, but so obviously the characters are not accurate in the sense that the characters are very different looking than their comic book counterparts in that sense. But the one thing I will say is that despite having this, they didn't smack you in the face with it. Like, obviously you knew that they were different races and genders than their comic book counterparts, but they didn't turn it into this preachy thing where they're trying to use it as a plot point or try to force something down your throat. So it didn't feel super forced. And if you never knew anything about the comics, you probably wouldn't think anything about the diversity of the cast. And the other part that a lot of people have talked about that review bombs were because of the gay representation of one of the characters being a gay man in the movie, having a husband and a son that we meet in the movie. Now, obviously, this was not essential to the plot as far as him being gay. His motivations for regaining his trust in humanity could have been done with as a straight man with a wife. So obviously it wasn't a plot point. It was there just to have him as a gay man. So it wasn't necessary in that sense, but they didn't drive it home with it being a big deal and talking about it as like, oh my gosh, they come into the scene and they make a big deal about him being gay or anything. So the same thing with the rest of the representation, even though it's there and it's not necessary to the plot, it doesn't change anything to the plot. But they at least don't do it in a preachy way that's trying to like force these things down our throat. They're just there, which I feel like is not something that they do not do a lot in, whether it's in movies, TV shows, comics, or whatever. They use it at this point to try to preach and to force instead of letting it happen a little more naturally. So even though not comic accurate in that sense, but it was handled about as well as I could have expected from what I was expecting them to do with the way they were talking about this film. So looking a little bit more at the characters of this movie, we want to talk about Icarus as probably one of a better known Eternals. None of them are super well known. He was kind of portrayed as this Superman-esque character, at least power-wise, and even commented on as being called Superman in the movie and one of the DC references. But it turned out Icarus was kind of used as the villain of this movie, or at least the antagonist, in the sense that he was behind the death of Ajax, and he was the one pushing to let the Celestial be born and threatening to kill and fight his fellow Eternals. Now, obviously, at the end, he was not able to go through with stopping Cersei from killing the Celestial, with him remembering his love for her, and they kind of built that up, their romance of how that happened throughout the years. So he still had a little piece of that in him, even though they kind of turned him into the villain. And he ended up, I believe, flew himself into the sun, so we have to assume he's dead, but you just never know. If they wanted to, they could probably try to bring him back and say he didn't die. I don't really know far as what there'll be plans with him going forward, but obviously a departure from the comics, kind of making him the villain, so to speak. Maybe not in the classic sense of the villain, but he was definitely the antagonist of the movie for the most part. And obviously is different from his comic book counterpart as he becomes kind of the leader of the not the Avengers, the Eternals going forward. And once they come to Earth, and they kind of switched that role and gave it to Cersei, which I don't necessarily have a problem with. In this particular instance, I do feel it was a little forced making him the villain. You know, it's like, I didn't really like it personally that they went that route with him, but it wasn't the worst thing ever either. Not my ideal choice, and I would have liked to have seen him stay the hero, so that's a little bit of a bummer that they kind of went that route and made him like that. But it wasn't like the worst thing that they've done either. But definitely it was Cersei was the main character of this film. We kind of start off with her. It's kind of her connection to the humans. She was always the one that was connected to the humans since they arrived on Earth. And it was her that was able to, with that connection, being chosen by Ajax to replace her as the one who could communicate with the Celestial. And she was the one that eventually used her powers to change with her transmorphing matter to transform the Celestial into basically a giant iceberg in the Indian Ocean. So she was obviously a little bit more well known in the comic book community. She's been part of the Avengers and a lot of different stories that went on back in the 90s. So I'm a little more familiar with her character, and I was pretty happy with her portrayal. I feel like they did her pretty well, and I didn't mind her being in the lead. I feel like it did pretty good, and I would be interested to see her going forward as part of maybe an Avengers, or no, we don't know exactly what's going to happen based on the ending of the movie, but I'm pretty sure they're going to get dragged into some kind of Avengers type comic. And just looking at some of the other Eternals, Ajax, I feel like, played by Selma Hayek, I didn't feel like she was supposed to be used as a lot more prominent figure, but because of the way the film was made, with a lot of flashbacks going back and forth, she was never in present day because she was dead. And they wanted to use her as this prominent person to kind of in the lives of the Eternals, but because of the way we're just seeing some flashbacks, I didn't feel that prominence. It's just like, oh, she's dead, she's gone, and then I didn't feel her presence lingering like as this heavy weight on the Eternals. Obviously, you could tell they were sad and upset that she died, but I didn't feel that the prominence they were trying to portray with her got through, and so it didn't feel that impactful of a death. Thena was another character that was not utilized a lot. I figure with a bigger name actress like Angelina Jolie playing her, they might use her a little bit more, but she felt as more of a supporting character, kind of off to the side. And obviously, with a cast being this large, not everyone can have a ton of time to shine. But she just kind of fell off to the side, and I feel like they kind of had some missed opportunities, as I'm going to talk about with the Deviants. I feel like there was a missed opportunity with the Deviant Crow, and we'll kind of circle back to that when we talk about the Deviants. But I feel like she's just not very utilized very much. And some of the other Eternals, they all had little moments to shine. We got to see different unique power sets from each one, whether it be a strength, a speed, or their minds, technology, the mind controls from Druig, and different things like that. They weren't too overshadowed by that much. I would say probably the least likable character was probably Sprite. She kind of felt resentful and spiteful of her position, and kind of in the end turned on them, but still they kind of just forgave it and kind of brushed it off, the fact that she betrayed them and stabbed Cersei in the back, literally. And I guess that their bonds of the thousands of years was enough, but she just didn't come across very likable. The rest of them had a little bit of better redeeming qualities. You could kind of see where some of them are coming from, so it wasn't as bad. But I feel like with as big a cast as they had, they did pretty good. I will say that that some of the characters like Kumail Nanjiani's character, he just kind of went off to the end. He wasn't even in the final fight, which is a little odd that he was there, but he just kind of decided not to participate. So that was a little weird how they kind of did his character, and at the end he's like back with them now, and it's like, okay, you did what you thought was right, and like, okay, well, if you agreed with that, then you should have helped, one way or the other, whether he helped Icarus or the rest of the Eternals. It kind of felt odd that he kind of just sat out of it. but all in all, the characters were fairly well handled for the most part. Then coming back to another character that I want to cover, because a personal character that I like is Black Knight, and he was not in the film a whole lot, but he was mostly used as a setup for future MCU films, and we will talk about that in a moment. But I did like they kind of started to connect that Cersei Dane Whitman Black Knight relationship from the Avengers comics, so it was a nice nod to that, and it could be something interesting to look at going forward. Looking real quick at the Deviants, I will say that the Deviants were not used in the manner I thought they were. They were not used as like a main villains. They were more of irritants, I would say, plot devices used as irritants, much like I've said that Black Manta was used in the Aquaman movie, where he is a villain, but he's not the main villain of the movie, and he's just kind of used to get as an irritant to the heroes and to kind of get in their way. And so that's kind of what I felt the Deviants were in this movie. We did get one Deviant of note, which was Crow, but Crow was very not utilized very well. And I feel like there was a really missed opportunity here with him and Athena, with their history in the comics of them having a relationship together, having children together. I feel like this is a really missed opportunity, as we saw Athena struggling to with the memories of her past lives, and Crow getting some of that knowledge that he absorbed from Ajax and Gilgamesh. He could have remembered a life, and maybe they had had some kind of connection in the past, and that could have been touched upon not only as a nod to the comic, but had some weight to give the Deviants some more credence, as like they were kind of used as pawns by the Celestials just as much as the Eternals were, and kind of pitted against each other. And I feel like that would have been a kind of a missed opportunity that they kind of glossed over, and I feel like that connection with Athena would have been something good to touch upon, and I don't feel like they handled the Deviants very well in this movie. Okay, now we're kind of just wrapping things up. Let's looking at how this affects the future of the MCU. Obviously, they're setting up some kind of conflict with the Celestials. With the end of the movie, the some of them getting taken by the Celestials, and we don't really know where that's going to lead. But I feel like that will be something that might be drawn in other heroes from the MCU to fight in some kind of conflict. I don't know exactly what storylines they could be going for. Maybe drawing more from Earth X, where the heroes will be in more conflict with the Celestials. It is possible, but they have definitely teased that the Celestials are not done and the Eternals are going to return. Obviously, the first of the post-credit scenes was revealing of Star Fox, who is another fairly well-known Eternal who has ties to the Avengers, and is also the brother of Thanos, which brings us to the point that Thanos is basically an Eternal with a deviant gene kind of thing, so he's basically a deviant, and kind of brings up the question why they didn't interfere in that, but they never really say why anything specific about Thanos, but that should have been something that warranted. So that's obviously something, a kind of a plot hole that they never really address, and a lot of fans had this question even going into this. But Star Fox coming in is definitely interesting, because I thought he was one of the more well-known that I knew Eternals coming in. So I was surprised he wasn't involved, but now he's in it, so we'll see how he's brought into the mix going forward. And we get Pip the Troll, who we've seen in some different things with Adam Warlock. I've even seen him with Silver Surfer. So like I was wondering like who's gonna come with him. You know, I was like Warlock or Silver Surfer, some of these characters that were probably in my head. I honestly wasn't even thinking about Star Fox when it happened, but it was a nice little nod to see Pip the Troll come on to the screen as well. And looking at the other post-credit scene, definitely completely setting up Black Knight. I was all for it. Black Knight's one of my personal favorite characters, and we saw him getting the ebony blade, and we know that it is cursed, and by taking blood, you know, with the blade, you get a bloodlust, and so that could be something they're going to be looking at in future films of how Dane has to overcome it. And we haven't really got the whole story as to whether how much he knows about his history. We got a little bit like he was going to talk about it, but I never did. We got some nods to his uncle in the movie, Nathan Garrett, who was the evil Black Knight who fought Iron Man early in the comics, who gave this equipment and his castle to Dane, is how he got in the legacy. And then we also get, at the end, we hear a voice talking to Dane, and it cuts. away. So we don't know if it possibly could be Sir Percy of Scandia, which is the first Black Knight, and a ghost who regularly talks with Dane. That is one option, or it is someone tied to the Avengers world. I could not recognize the voice right off just after one viewing to tell if it was a voice that I'm familiar with, so it could have very well been some kind of Avenger character that we've seen already that's kind of bringing Dane into it. But my guess is it is probably tied to Sir Percy of something along those lines as to what we are seeing with the Black Knight going forward. But overall, this movie of the Eternals turned out to be more enjoyable than I thought would have been. I was kind of excited just from the fact that I am a big Black Knight fan and I really wanted to see his character, and I was excited that he was in it. But obviously, the Eternals are not a super popular, well-known group, so there wasn't probably a lot of buzz from comic book fans about seeing the Eternals, but it was definitely handled much better than I thought it was, so I will give them credit that even though I'm always for complete accuracy with comic book characters' looks and how they act, but given the circumstances of the fact that they did use a very diverse cast for this, I will say they handled it really well, as this being a very polarizing topic in the comic community come before the movie, that they did handle it well for what we got. And I was happy that they didn't use it to preach or shove kind of political and social messages at us, the audience, through this, but just let the characters be the characters. And overall, I feel like this was a pretty enjoyable movie. There are definitely flaws. There's a little bit of confusion, pacing issues at time, but I think that it will be and the fact that the movie is not super action-packed compared to some other Marvel movies could turn off some fans who just want to see the action. But all in all, I would say this is a pretty good movie, and I would recommend seeing it for yourselves. And it is something that I feel like I could rewatch. Obviously, maybe not the top tier Marvel movies, but a lot better than I was expecting. But anyway, guys, let me know your thoughts on Eternals. Have you seen it? Are you going to see it? What do you think of these characters? What do you think is going to happen going forward in the MCU? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Like and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you guys next time.